Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Psy. Join us for a conversation about the transformative power of community. Together, we talk about exploring psychedelics for pleasure, creating more equitable access through gardening, and how our kinky buttons change. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. We have another delightful, edgy, the usual radical conversation in this space that I am so excited to share with you. So thank you for tuning in and joining me here once again. Psy talked about needing more spaces for queer people, for integration, for connection, for healers. And I do want to name that I am a queer relationship anarchist, psychotherapist who is working with psychedelic medicines and therapy. And I want to share the wisdom and the teachings that I have found through my training with all of you in this space to be able to have that be accessible for all people, talking about equitable access here. I know that there are not enough spaces where this medicine is accessible. The site that I'm training at, Sauna Healing Collective, is a nonprofit. They are just about to actually start a queer ketamine group as well. And so there is access to these things and it is rising, but still there is not enough. And specifically when we're talking about sexuality, right? All of my research here, wow, there is so much societal pressure, internalized homophobia, internalized mononormativity, transphobia, right? All these different things that are present. And psychedelic medicines, drugs can be really powerful to unpack those messages, to shake up that snow globe and get a different perspective on life. And many of us explore our first steps outside of the status quo through drugs, right? One of the more common drugs is alcohol. I think back to my Christian self years ago who couldn't even cognitively hold the idea that I was queer. It was so shut down as sin that I couldn't even process any of my desires as that. Any sort of thought towards that sort of potential was immediately shut down in my psyche. And it wasn't until I was drunk, right? And we had our default mode network turned down, those inhibitions turned off, and I explored making out with a friend out at a bar, right? And afterwards, the next day, there was no integration. I did not have a community where I could go, where that was a safe space to explore what that was. And so it just got shut down and would happen again and again when I would get drunk, right? Of course, again, at the time, I had no frame for any of this because the community that I had was Christian and there was no safe space to process any of this. And so wow, just thinking about spanning, thinking about looking out to where I'm at now, I have a community of all queer people around me, which has liberated so many conversations and exploration and ability to truly breathe into the power of my queerness in so many different ways. But it took that first drug of alcohol, right, to open that up. And from there, the power of psychedelics, as someone who is a trauma survivor in, sexual trauma and the larger patriarchal trauma of what it meant to go through purity culture. Wow, psychedelics have expanded my capacity for pleasure. Of course, it first started off with unpacking more of the tender emotional aspects of it, but the spaces I'm able to access now are so profound. The pleasure I'm able to feel in my body is radical. And so when I'm thinking about this as a psychotherapist who's intending to specifically work with sex and relationships, and we have this beautiful tool, right? These drugs and psychedelic medicines, what does that future look like, right? Of course, there's the initial processing of trauma. There is the initial check-ins with the body, but that full healing continuum, you've heard me talk about this, dear listener, goes all the way to pleasure and embodiment. Certain drugs in the near future are going to be a part of therapy. We're in the process of getting FDA approval for MDMA, right? Imagine the world of working with a trauma survivor through that initial processing all the way through to pleasure and embodiment with what is possible. I'm going to be a part of that movement, okay? But when I think about what that looks like, truly accessing pleasure in a therapy office, oof, there are so many feelings, internalized pressure around professionalism in these relationships. I mean, in my own journey, I don't know if I could have even accessed that sort of pleasure in a therapy office. Wow, that is a lot of pressure. Most of us don't even feel comfortable accessing that level of pleasure with a partner that we've been with for years, okay? So I can't even comprehend what sort of trust would be needed to be able to explore that sort of experience on a psychedelic with a therapist, So then I start to think about, yes, this work is going to happen at home, right? A lot of this healing, a lot of this pleasure embodiment is going to happen at home, okay? That's where I found it in my own solo journeys and exploring in that sort of safe space. And so I hope that in the coming years, as I continue to build this podcast space, the space of resources, that I can create episodes for you like this that talk about some of these complexities and empower you, dear listener, to have the wisdom that I have from my training and for that to be shared with you freely in this space so that we can all grow and that we can all heal together. It is so truly mind-boggling to me when we look out at the world and the wars and the atrocities and the deaths that are going on in our world, that any amount of our government and our resources are spent trying to prevent people from accessing plants. The plants and the mushrooms that grow out of our earth, that any government is trying to prevent us from access to that. I just truly can't comprehend. I mean, I understand, I hear the history, I know about the war on drugs, I know about the racial implications for all of this, I get it, but it just is truly mind-boggling to me that any amount of our resources are spent on trying to prevent people from access to nature. And when we have that access, right, how does change happen? It's in community, okay? My first experiences of queerness, I didn't have that community to process, to integrate, to feel safe and seen and validated. And it took that community for me to step into breathing into my queerness. I think if you look all the way back to my episodes from day one, my voice is tight and I'm scared to talk about sex because it was still so taboo. And all of these conversations I have had with the various guests over the years and the radical community and all of my friends and lovers that I have built around me now have allowed me to breathe into this space and really let go of that shame. And that change happens in community. Remember, the mirrors, relationships are mirrors to your sense of self. And so if someone is beating you down, if society is beating you down, of course you're going to feel that. There is not something wrong with you for feeling that weight when you look into a mirror, right? And so I hope to create an intentional community with you each week. I know I can't see all of your faces, but I want you to know that if you're in this space, you are vibrating with whatever I'm putting out and these people are putting out, and I probably resonate with you and you could be deeply a part of my community in Chicago around here. And so I just want to say that I love you and that I hope you continue to feel into expansion, to feel into pleasure, and to really take that deep breath and know that you are loved. And speaking of community, I want to give a big shout out to 2 new Patreon members that joined in the last week, Tanya and Anna Maria. Thank you for supporting the podcast. this resource, right? The podcast, it is free. You can share this with any of your friends, and I want to keep it that way. Again, equitable access, right? Here's a free resource we can share around with our community. But the reality is, this is not free. I spend so much time each week crafting, honing, making this special gift for all of you. And so I am so deeply thankful for the Patreon members who support the podcast, either at $5 or $10 a month to keep this running. Get this, y'all. While I'm in grad school, I haven't been paid at all. I've been working 3 years of clinical work, hours and hours of clinical work, and none of it is paid. Because part of the APA requirements are that you don't get paid for this training, and that is a part of how the system runs, right? So many different larger institutions run off of the free labor of clinical interns. And so just throwing that out there that I'm not paid at all during this journey in my life. Eventually I'll get out of the system, and I will. But for now, all of you Patreon supporters are supporting me and the podcast. So thank you. And I recently just had a really beautiful medicine experience with my community that I am still integrating the joy from. And on the Patreon website, I did include some of the integration tools that I have been using from my community. One of those things is a scribble projective drawing that was really fun and brought out a lot of artistic creativity to my experience, as well as a somatic integration meditation on the Patreon platform as well. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast, supporting me, keeping this resource free, then head on over to the Patreon link below. I would dearly appreciate your support in this space. And otherwise, just continue to send this podcast to your friends, y'all. We are growing each week, and it's so beautiful to see the numbers expand. And I'm just so delighted. I'm here right now, but God, where are we going to be in 10 years, dear listener? What sort of radical intimacy and pleasure and embodiment are we going to be feeling into at that point? It's going to be so good. And I'm so thankful to have you in this space with me and growing with me each week. So, dear listener, with that, I am sending you all my love, and let's tune in to today's episode. So then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
My name is Sai. I use they, them pronouns. I am the instigator of Queerly Psychedelic. I started this project several years ago because I didn't see a lot of representation of queer people in psychedelics, and I didn't see a lot of focus put on queer people in psychedelics. And after having a lot of my own really powerful and transformational experiences, I was like, let's do this thing. I'm not the only one having these experiences.
Totally. Yes.
So, I am a cultivator. I'm trans and queer in every sense of the word. And I just really love psychedelics and queer people. And my goal is to help queer people love themselves. That's my number one thing. So
beautiful.
I kind of try and work with that in mind.
Beautiful. Well, I'm excited to talk to you about all things queerness and psychedelics. I at least in my clinical work, I've seen a lot of how psychedelics can be really powerful to help people to expand and open up to areas that maybe there's been a lot of shame around, particularly. I mean, I was talking about this with one of my mentors, just even thinking about how, a lot of people talk about sometimes their first queer experience being under substances. You have a little bit of alcohol, it lets down that, those judgments, maybe enough to have that first experience where you cross that threshold where you're letting go of society's, holds on our internal homophobia. And thinking about some of that same work coming out, I've seen in my clinical work with psychedelics, right? People having these psychedelic experiences where they're thinking more expansively about sex and relationships and gender in ways that they've never thought about in the past. So I'd be curious if any of that resonates with you and what you've seen in the community.
Yeah, I can speak to my own experience at
Yeah.
least. That's where I try and come from for a lot of my interactions with folks. Is like one of the reasons that I started Queerly Psychedelic actually is because I went and heard another trans person speak about their experiences with DMT and self actualization. And I just found that to be really powerful. And after hearing that and having my own experiences, I was like really motivated to try and like at least start like a landing spot for other people who were maybe like lost in having these
Yeah.
experiences. And I grew up in the 90s raving
Sure.
and really like shied away from a lot of traditional psychedelics. Like I ate a lot of MDMA back in the day, but
Hmm.
really wasn't interested in like acid or mushrooms or anything like that because it didn't really seem to like jibe. And I would always heard this like crazy dare fear
Oh
mongering about how
no.
you're gonna like wreck your brain,
Oh no.
like I grew up in the 80s and 90s.
Totally.
Once I finally moved past just those substances and started really exploring with some of the more traditional psychedelics, it was just like such an amazing opportunity to like meet myself and kind of break down some of the walls that I had not let really budge for a long time, like
Hmm.
be it from trauma or like past experiences or, whatever, like especially LSD for me has really helped me like move past some of the like shame that I was holding around my gender identity and like,
Sure.
uncertainty and unwillingness to like really dive deep and explore that within myself. So I'm like exceedingly grateful for LSD. Thank you, LSD.
Yeah.
Like I just really recognize that this is an opportunity for a lot of people to like meet themselves differently and like there wasn't and still maybe aren't tons of resources for people who are like having these experiences. Like when I first had some of my early psychedelic experiences, I was kind of like traumatized almost
Mm,
by like not really being able to like bring home some of the things that I was realizing about myself and
sure.
like seeking therapy like these many years ago, the view was very different and I was
Mm,
getting like non-positive like feedback from therapists about like, oh, you're just taking drugs, like
uh,
and it's like, okay, but like also I'm having these experiences and these things are coming up for me and I need to talk about them. But there wasn't like
yeah,
a good it was harder back then to find like a good like support network around using substances and also learning about yourself, especially transitioning at a quote unquote later age, which like fuck that, transition at whatever age you want, like be who you
sure.
are at any age you want. But like I just like found that lack of support really like jarring and also like really forced me to go out and like find these other people who were having these experiences, at least so I could hear about them and have somebody to talk to or at least hear from their experience and try and like find peace with my own, I guess. But yeah, I'm sorry, that's very meandering.
No,
But
it's so important to talk about, right?
yeah, I think there's just like not enough space given for queer people to explore themselves and find out different things about themselves in this space. I use space like loosely because like whatever the psychedelic space is.
Totally, totally.
I don't know if you've like had any experiences with like your own like sexuality or gender identity and psychedelics, but it's like can
Sorry,
be like
listeners can't see my face, which was like, yes.
but it can be like really both like powerful and also like great, what do I do with this information?
Totally.
Like how
Yeah.
do I integrate this? How do I bring it back to my life? How do I like
Yeah.
act on it if I am feeling
Yeah.
like called to act on it? Like
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, huge, huge. Like you said, the integration. How do we take these experiences and bring them into our life moving forward? I mean, and you hit on such an important piece too with therapists when they're working from their own bias, depending on their
Hmm.
education, depending on their worldview and their positioning, if they're still in the paradigm of dare and all these other non-research backed understandings of drug use, we can say that pretty flat out these days, they're
Yeah.
going to cause harm for their clients when they look at them and say, look, what, that's just a drug, what do you mean? Or even impose any of that judgment and shame on these experiences that are really transformative for so many people. At least I've seen, you're speaking to, I've experienced. So we can only extrapolate out how many people in the world are having these sorts of experiences. And we all need community, right, to be able to process that, whether it's, a circle of friends, a therapist. And when you don't have that space, you're just kind of locked up in your own experience up there, trying to make sense of it and being unsure of what it all means. And so it's a really valuable conversation to have, and particularly within queer spaces, right? Because you can create, psychedelic experience spaces where you process that and have that community integration. But the reality is, when you're queer, other people might not be as accepting of that, and you have to understand that part of the world. And so it's important to create a safer space within the community where you can actually process this without being afraid that someone across the circle is going to be judging you or making comments. It's a really big need to have that safe space to process these things.
Yeah, and I still actually unfortunately think there's like a lack of like spaces for queer people to gather and do like peer integration. There are a few like really awesome groups out there doing free or donation based work for queer people and
Mhm.
queer BIPOC. It's just like it's limited though, and I think like knowing that it's out there is so limited too. There's like I can think of one, specifically one trans and non-binary integration group that's run,
Mhm.
that is free, that is like accessible and
Yeah.
happens like regularly and monthly, that is also like stewarded by trans people. But like
Mhm.
one, like how many
Right.
trans people are having these experiences and like needing that support and just being like, where do I even go? Like I have people reach out to me on Instagram from like all over the world and
Mhm.
be like, I didn't even know that there was like queer, focus in psychedelics. And it's increased definitely over the last few years. Initially, it was just kind of surprising to hear people's stories and how like unsupported they are in these experiences. I think that's really like kept me going while like I queerly psychedelic isn't like my full-time gig. Like I work for a living.
Mhm.
No
Sure.
one's out there like funding queerly psychedelic but me, which is
Yeah.
fine. Like I'm good to do that, but like I wish that there was like more support for the queer people that are trying to do good work for other queer people in this space, not just myself, but like some of the other people out there. Like that's I think like could be like the most transformational thing for queer people in the psychedelic arena, people who are wanting to explore. And as these things become like so much more popular, I think there's just going to be ever increasing need for folks to find that support. And I'd love to see like, just do something for these people that are trying to support like marginalized groups generally. So be that, queer folks or BIPOC or, choose whatever intersection you would like. Like there's
Mhm.
just it's lacking generally, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
I would really love to see more support for queer people. Like it's
Yeah.
out there, but like I also feel like there's a lot of like studying queerness versus like being in it, like
Mm.
actually living. I don't know. It's a
Sure.
weird thing to say, I guess, but like I see some of the out queer people who talk about, psychedelics, and it's like they're both like pigeonholed into only
Mm.
speaking about queerness and psychedelics, but also like it seems so cold sometimes. Like
Mm.
you're studying like your own people. Where's the connection
Sure.
there? I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy, but um,
Hey, I mean, I'm there with you. It's part of the professionalism culture potentially, right? Who knows? Like you
yeah,
have to take this sort of like very distance, like I can't name as the professional my own identities or connection to this group or how it shows up. We must study clinical under microscope only like this. So it could be part of the paradigm of research and stuff that's so
it
within a
seems
certain
like
lens.
strangely detached though to
Yeah.
like be part of this group and also be like studying your your people.
Yeah. And as I
So,
work on my dissertation on relationship anarchy as a relationship anarchist, it's like it's kind of I have to name the fact that it's impossible to be unattached to this, right? And it's if we think about things like, just quantum mechanics in terms of being able to know that when we observe the phenomenon, it results in a different outcome. I mean, we just we just got to think about these things, but that's okay. We're in a
yeah.
different paradigm with research, and I'm happy to have this space with you and the podcast space where we can talk about it in a more, attached way. And I think that's hopefully a lot of what I hope to do in this space by bringing on people who can speak about their lived experience and their body and their soul and like what it meant for them. So I'd love to hear more if you have like a particular trip in mind that was really transformative that you think the listeners would benefit from hearing.
Yeah, I like when I like talk about my experiences, I like to give like the good and the bad because unfortunately, like there can be traumatic experiences with psychedelics. Also, I really think people should shy away from like the rose colored glasses thing where like it can all just be wonderful and great because like I've had experiences where I like relived like physical trauma that I've experienced, throwing up for like 6 hours, just like heaving and like trying to like release these things, but like also recognizing that they're coming up. That can leave you in a really vulnerable place if you don't have support after your experience. So like I've had a couple of trips specifically that were like very meaningful to me. One was of the throwing up for multiple
Mm,
hours, like reliving like trauma that I
mm,
experienced at a younger age and like maybe had tucked away in some ways.
yeah.
I'm a full believer in the fact that people can like recover trauma that like they have forgotten on purpose. Like their brain is like, we're gonna forget this to protect you, but like I've had it come back on psychedelics and
Mhm.
that's difficult. And that left me like a truly like broken person for a while because I
Mm,
was not able to like effectively find the support that I needed. The
yeah.
therapist that I was seeing was like, well, you can't take this seriously because you were on drugs. Like,
Oh, huh.
yeah, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, she's
Okay,
not
therapist.
obviously not my therapist
Yeah.
anymore, but
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
but like it took me a long time to recover from that experience and like find peace and like really force me along my healing journey. On the full opposite end of that, like I've had
Mhm.
these really beautiful experiences of self-acceptance, self-actualization, like really trying to like view myself in the light of my transness and my queerness and the way that I choose to engage in like relationships with other people because I'm also would consider myself a relationship anarchist and like have been, polyamorous or open for like many years.
Mhm.
Also having that connection with other people. Like I am not a stranger to like, psychedelics with partners, with groups, with people that I care deeply for, people that I like, just met,
Yeah, totally.
Some of my most potent experiences have been alone and like intentional, but I also think that there's something really beautiful about like the community that you can find around tripping with other people and also integrating with other people. One experience was just like I to juxtapose my horrible experiences that I've
Sure.
had. I have this like one experience that I tell people about sometimes. I was tripping, and as someone who's lived with depression for all of their life, truly, unfortunately. I set the intention for one experience to just like feel happy, which seems like so simple and kind of
Mm,
like almost too simple, I set my intention, I set my space. I was at home, I was like by myself, and that's fine. I had my music set and I was just chilling and I took a relatively high dose of LSD and I just was like, I want to feel happy.
mm,
And I started feeling this like welling of like emotion in like my chest and like in my mind's eye, one of my someone who was my friend at the time came to me and said, "You're gonna feel it. I promise you're gonna feel
Mhm.
it." And in that moment, I had like this outpouring of like joy and happiness and love in a way that like it's not always easy for me to tap into in my day to day.
Mhm.
But I look back at that experience and I'm like, wow, even on my hard days, it's nice to be able to look back at that and be like, even if I'm not feeling it today, I have the capacity for that. I know I'm capable of that. I know that it's still there for me. It's helped me see my depression in different ways. I wouldn't say that psychedelics have cured my depression, definitely not. But like just knowing that I have the capacity for those deep emotions and that feeling on days when I might feel like a little dead inside
Yeah.
really makes the day easier. So while that might sound like a really weird, like, and simple intention to set, I just also want to remind people that like carrying your depression maybe isn't always going to be the solution. Maybe just having different perspective on the mental health issues that you struggle with can make it easier, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Totally. I mean, psychedelics will not cure depression, right? It's a tool, it's a part of the pieces. Therapy doesn't cure depression, right? Like it's a tool, it's
Hmm.
part of the process, of what expands your perspectives, like you're saying, to look at things in different ways, to maybe, move forward with new ideas and new neuronal pathways, right? Like it's all of that
Hmm.
and the work of the individual within the community, right? And all of that sort of
Hmm.
change. So and to me when you're saying it sounds so simple, I'm like, no, that's great, like this is totally the work, this is what you do, right? I'm always working with clients about like, yeah, forming intentions to the medicine, because it's complicated. You can't always expect where it's going to take you, right? You can have that
Yeah.
experience where it's bringing up trauma that you didn't know about, and I've heard and seen that too. And if you don't have support there, if you're doing it alone, sometimes we recommend people have like the fireside. Have you heard of them?
Hmm.
Yeah, there's like
Oh,
a
yeah, yeah.
totally. And for listeners that don't know, there's a fireside group that provides access to support when on psychedelics via the phone, because texting would be hard to do while on a psychedelic.
Yeah, I think it's like
Um,
886 Fireside. I'm almost positive.
and there's a
Fireside Project.
totally, and there's like a times to it too. It's like 11 to 11 PT or something. So people would need to check
Hmm.
that totally. But yeah, I mean, you can't predict necessarily what's going to come up, right? In that sort of way. So you're kind of letting
Yeah.
go, but within that, to be able to set intentions of, what you're wanting to focus on with that work can be so powerful. And obviously, there's always the space to say, I don't want to set an intention, aka I want an open
Yeah, yeah.
intention.
Pleasure is a valid intention.
Oh my God, pleasure is such a valid intent. That has been some of my most favorite experiences personally,
Yeah,
to
same.
like try and let go of any of the cognitive and just step into pure sensation with
Mhm.
psychedelics. That's been huge for me, right? And like you said earlier, it becomes a template for what's possible in terms of our
Mhm.
emotional state and our body and our connection. And yeah, when we're trying to set intentions for it, we're always trying to like help people to have like an open, like, teach me about this, or show me about this, given the like nature where it can be so unpredictable, to have that sort of openness to what might come up and the ways that it might take different forms, and not give you that message that we're always like searching for an answer. It can be
Mhm.
so hard, but we have these experiences, and then like you said, on those days where it's dark, to be able to remember back to that moment, that's so profound.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Like, I look at psychedelics as just a way to like meet and know yourself differently. You can get stuck in these like patterns or like ruts or like just general ways of being, and like sometimes you've got to shake the snow globe a little bit, let things fall a little differently, and just reflect on that and try and bring it home in ways that are like important for you, which is like different for everybody. Maybe you just don't have enough pleasure and joy in your life, and you're like, fuck it, I want to eat, an eighth of mushrooms and just be happy for the afternoon, or like look at trees in nature, or like whatever. Like it's okay to just be curious and like not really tethered to like this like healing. I think a lot of
Sure.
people lately, especially, like really want to tie psychedelics to like healing. And like the problem with that is that you're asking all these individual people to do this work without creating these like larger changes in society and their like community in their sphere to like support them to like hold these changes long terms. Yeah, it's great that like we want to bring psychedelic therapy to all these people, but like my question always comes back to, is it accessible for a lot of queer people? The answer is no. I'm speaking for queer community because that's who I can speak for, I guess,
Mhm.
like at least for myself. I could not afford to go get psychedelic therapy in Oregon. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, I work for a living. I live in
Totally.
Colorado. Like, $20,000 is not like just sitting around for me. And when
No,
you think that it costs like pennies to grow mushrooms,
I know.
it really, really gets me. People are pushing for medicalization. Like, where is that $20,000 going? It's not going to the facilitator because they're paying tons of fees and registrations and all this. It's not going to the person that's growing the mushrooms, which arguably is one of the more important people in this chain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to the aftercare to like support community, to support bigger change for
Mm-hmm.
folks. You're like, it's like individualizing it in a lot of ways that are like super toxic in my
Sure.
opinion.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes.
So to just be like, oh, we can like, yeah, everyone will be able to go get psychedelic therapy is like a ridiculous pipe dream. And like, who are the people that can most benefit from this? And also, like, what do we need to change in our society instead of just being like, everyone should eat mushrooms? Because that's not the solution. It's not the solution. So
Yeah.
sorry, I get really like worked up about
No, it's important. It's passionate.
it
It's good.
because there's this big push for people to just like be taking psychedelics, but there's so little recognition for actually helping people make lasting change and what that requires and what that looks like. And for a lot of people, maybe you do go pick up an eighth of mushrooms and you eat them and you have this really like profound experience. But if you're going back to your same situation and you're not able to like bring those messages home and like make lasting change because of the situation that you are in for whatever reason, like societally or systemically or whatever, like that's ridiculous to tell people to just eat mushrooms. And the individualization of it is kind of gross to me.
Oh,
So
totally.
until there's like a push for like collective change, collective movement, collective ways in which we like look at our whole society, mushrooms or psychedelics or MDMA therapy or whatever is not going to be the answer. There has to be like community support and care around it. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's the missing puzzle piece right now, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also to like people who are like, I want to have psychedelic therapy and like it's not affordable to me. Honestly, try and grow your own. Growing your own mushrooms is so therapeutic. Like personally, like therapeutic. They require of you as someone that has cultivated for a long time. I actually find like mushrooms, the cultivation side of it, to be the therapy for me. The eating them, sometimes I eat mushrooms, but not very often. But I do love to grow them because that discipline is the medicine for me.
Mm-hmm.
So
Gardening.
grow your own, folks.
It's not funny. It's just sad that I'm like sitting over here. I'm like, oh, psychologist in training. Can she post a podcast where she a guest says this? Like, So I'm like, yeah,
You could cut it out.
no, I'm not. I'm not cutting it out. You said it. I had a guest who said it. I was just holding space for their wisdom, and I will say facts. Like facts are that you can buy spores for mushrooms on Etsy because it's not illegal to buy the spores in many states. In some states it is, but many states the spores.
Couple states that it is illegal to like purchase spores, but like
We're just stating,
If
I'm just
if
stating
if
facts.
you can, if it is accessible to you, I highly recommend trying to do it yourself because there is value in learning to
Mhm.
do it yourself. So,
You heard it here, folks. Yeah. In terms of what you had said, I mean, yeah, the capitalization on this is huge, obviously, and it's already inaccessible to so many people, right? Which is why I enjoy, in terms of like anarchy philosophies, to have a conversation about it in this space, right? Like, how can we take the knowledge, the training that I'm getting, and put it into a public space where we talk about these things so that the reality is, even in like in a harm reduction philosophy, that particularly within our culture and the ways that it's inaccessible for most people, and just in general, the majority of drug use is going to occur outside of the therapy room, right? And so,
mhm,
like, what's the role as an educator to speak to that in a harm reduction framework? I think it's to talk about it, right? And to be able to
yeah,
name these things. And, when we're thinking about like diagnoses and mental health and all these things, it's always within a context of the relationships that we're having that maybe have created these patterns and etc., but not just like the relationships to people, but also the relationships to our ecology, the relationships to larger structures. And so, like you're saying,
mhm,
if we just say, oh, it's the individual does the healing, the individual does that, we're not really understanding that the suffering is a result of the larger relationships to society and other things that are creating these dynamics for us. And so it's such a nuanced thing, but I hope that as conversations like this continue to happen and there's more space and more people are talking about it, that we will see that collective change that is probably going to occur outside of the therapy room because it's not accessible for all people.
it's unfortunate too because yes, probably most people in this world could benefit from therapy, and, like, I'm very realistic about psychedelics, and, like, there's gonna be people who don't want to. I don't think psychedelics are like a cure-all. I think they're an opportunity for people to imagine something different. And while like our society can definitely use some reimagining, in my opinion, I think it's like kind of naive almost to think that psychedelics are going to do that. The longer that I'm like in this space, quote unquote, the more I'm just like, there's so many other bigger things that need to change before like this can actually have like a huge impact. Watching like the capitalization of psychedelics and like how people are moving, how decrim movements and legalization movements are coming around. It's just like people are unfortunately seeing this as like their shot at like living the capitalist dream, whatever that is, versus like wanting to help people. I don't know. It's been weird to watch over the years. It's been increasingly strange over the last year and a half as like Colorado, where I live, has started putting together their framework for whatever that's going to look like, which
Yeah.
is like very medicalized. As a cultivator, like, I grow not to sell, like I grow to gift. I give free medicine to queer people when they approach me, and like if it's something people need and I can offer it, is so little to like do that work. Like it's time consuming, but at the same time it's like mushrooms aren't like worthless, but they're also like not worth the way that they're being valued. Because they're difficult to grow them, like it's weird to see people being like, it's going to cost you 10, 20 grand to go do this thing. And it's off putting, I guess, like at the very least, to have seen like both sides of it, to be on like the self healing side of it, the cultivation side of it, and then also watch, medicalization like happening without like people really understanding all the ramifications of medicalization and how that's like making it specifically, it's not decriminalization, it's legalization, which is still criminalizing people who are doing it outside of this like weird legal framework that they're making up. So like, am I going to be like, is somebody going to be considered like a criminal still for growing a personal amount or a giftable amount where is the support for the community care support to like put people who don't have access to like therapeutic mushroom journeys? Like, how are we supporting like marginalized groups to go be within their community and do these things? How is this like collective movement supporting community care, really? That's like kind of a huge sticking point for me. And I like do speak to that on some regularity when I speak, because I don't personally like want to go to a therapist and do mushrooms. I don't want to sit in a doctor's office and do that. Like mushrooms, like nature. They like being out in nature, and like the clinical setting isn't right for a lot of people, I think. And for some folks, it will be the space that they want to go to. Also, there's a lot of marginalized communities that could really benefit from these things, and like they're being specifically excluded by going through medical models.
Oh, totally. There's a lot of communities that are in jail for this, right? While we're over
Yeah,
here, just you know what I mean? It's
talking about it.
totally.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's absurd in so many different levels, and the capitalization of healing and like the working within
Hmm.
the systems to try, like it seems like if we follow cannabis's model, right, of medicalization to recreational, that's kind of the progress. And so, but then doing that and how certain people charge, like you're saying, $20,000, where I'm working at, it's a nonprofit, and we try to offer a community care fund for people of different marginalized identities. So there's definitely people like doing the work, but it is not enough. And it's
Yeah.
it's a huge problem. So I mean, you're speaking to something that is absolutely crucial to talk about. And, especially if we think about, like you said, yeah, different medicines have different settings, and different people will benefit from having a therapist office where it is more
Hmm.
controlled and calm, particularly when you're wanting to work on trauma, right? But that's
Hmm.
not the right environment for everybody, right? And I've
Yeah.
seen people where it's particularly not the right way to work with what they've got going on, and it is too dysregulating and other sorts of things. And so they
Hmm.
try it and they leave and go to other therapies. Like, it's certainly not the answer. And it's definitely just, it's hard when you think about psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers. Like, you see about people who are from particular extremist groups using psychedelics and feeling more empowered within that paradigm of their thought, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like psychedelics aren't always gonna make everybody think
No.
like a hippie. Like not
No.
everyone's gonna be like, we're all one. Like for a lot of people, psychedelics are, like you said, not a non-specific amplifier for whatever they already have going on. You know, people talk about like, oh, ego death and whatever, but like for so many people, psychedelics are this weird, like ego feeding, like thing that just make them more certain in their whatever belief it is, be that like a destructive belief or a like societally harmful belief, or like just in their own like weird power. Like psychedelics aren't just always gonna fix it for you.
Not even
Like
close.
there's so many like conditions around having some sort of like ego disillusionment experience. Even if you have that, sometimes you come back even worse. Like I hate to say
Sure.
it, but like have moments on psychedelics where you like feel like God. You're like, damn, I could fucking do anything. And like maybe you can do anything, but what are you gonna take that power and use it towards? Like towards your own gratification, or like are you gonna work for other people? Like not everybody goes the working for other people route. So
No, no,
and
they
there's plenty
don't.
of people in this space that are like very open about just like money, power, title, whatever it is. And it's like those are we going to say those people need to do more psychedelics? No, like we're going to say like what are you doing? Like why is that the goal, and like what's feeding
Mhm.
that?
Mhm.
And how is that beneficial to the medicines or to the people taking the medicines? Like how is like you choosing power over everything, like helping your community, your how is that furthering the message that people allegedly usually get from psychedelics, which is like we're all one, which I'm not discounting that. That's a very powerful experience.
Yeah.
But what are you doing with it? You know?
Sure.
That's my question to
Sure.
folks is like, and I tell people to ask that, like, what are you doing with this message that you're getting? Like, and if you're a community organizer in some way, like, who are you working for? If it's just you, maybe check yourself. If you're organizing just for you, check yourself maybe. But
Mm-hmm.
that's my 2 cents.
Totally. And you're gonna die, and eventually there'll be people living on. Like maybe you could have a larger perspective to helping humanity,
Yeah.
that's gonna come after you. Jesus, what a thought. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's why it's important to talk about it, like, in times as like a non-specific amplifier that can be such a tool within the right community structure and social environment where you're getting someone
Mhm.
like you who's asking those questions. And I think it was really interesting in my work with one of my supervisors, Dr. Jeff Beachy had done work with, in his clinical work with gang groups, and to hear that people would use MDMA before going on shootings, just like completely ripped out all of the ideas I had about, like, everyone's like, MDMA is the love drug, MDMA is this, it does that, it brings all this and that. And so to hear that, violence within that context was going on, it was like, oh yeah, not always, right? Set and setting, set
Yeah.
and setting.
Yeah. I mean, substances are not inherently good or bad. This is something that I think most people can agree on is like no substance is good or bad. They have like certain risk profiles and like what people use them for varies. I look back to like my time growing up raving in like the 90s and
Mhm.
2000 early 2000s and like when I
Sure.
was really in that scene before I like took a little break and I ate MDMA before we had like testing kits, before we knew what things were, and like for sure I ate not MDMA a couple times. Like, it used to happen back in the day, but like
Sure.
now we have these tools to like look at it and be like, okay, I'm eating like, a tested substance, responsibly dosing, I'm doing it at like healthier intervals, but like
Hmm.
back then we didn't know, but all we did was do it to like go party and go dance and go, get fucked up. A lot of people did back then, and a lot of people
Yeah,
still do. And no
totally.
shade to that. Just like know what you're taking, be aware of your settings. So I think a lot of us like maybe weren't back then and weren't necessarily concerned as much as we are now back then. So I try and like bring that to people, like be safer than I was.
Sure. Harm reduction, education, safety, right? And I mean, I hate
Yeah.
to plug this, but I think in a reality where this is the world we live in and access to things are tricky, and maybe you have a better resource, but you can buy those on Amazon.
Yes, yeah, you can buy like testing supplies. I always give a high five out to Dance Save because they're really out there trying.
Great. I was like, I need a better
And
plug than Jeff. I need a better plug than
Dan-
Jeff. Jesus.
Dance Save, go order your testing supplies on Dance Save. Get your fent strips. They just came out with a new fentanyl testing strip that is supposed to be more accurate. And like they're trying, they're out there trying to do the right thing. So
Hmm.
I'll give them a heads up and a high five. I think there's
Yeah,
also like Bunk Police also sells testing kits. If
very
you don't,
cool.
for some reason, want to support Dance Safe, you can go hang with Bunk Police too.
For sure. Yeah. But I love what you said about, like, drugs themselves not being bad. It's
Yeah,
more so that we can have different types of relationships to them, right? And I think that's
yeah.
we might be saying that in this space, but knowing that's not necessarily the cultural view on things,
Oh
right?
my
It's
gosh, no, the psychedelic exceptionalism is just like rampant right now, and
totally.
watching it is hard because I am grateful to some of the harm reduction people, not psychedelic harm reduction. I'm talking like real harm reduction people out there who have radicalized me beyond,
I know.
my own like maybe previous psychedelic exceptionalism, which is there's no bad drugs. No drug or substance users deserve to be hated on, criminalized. Like these people deserve love and support, just like everybody else in the world. Like having chaotic use of substances. I've also had chaotic use with like legal substances. So I also just think like people have this weird misconception that like all psychedelics are so safe, but like as someone that goes to like festivals that has volunteered like harm reduction at festivals, sees people like in different states, there's definitely problems with people abusing psychedelics too, and
Yeah.
like that weird misconception that like you can't abuse psychedelics. It's crazy to me. Let's
Mhm.
like just briefly like touch on ketamine, which is like, people can become mentally addicted to that escapism, and like it can be harmful to your body. And I'm not demonizing any substances, but like I had chaotic use with ketamine for a while, and like will not go back to it for my own like personal reasons, because it's like it doesn't serve me in a good way. But also to like think that all psychedelics are super safe is just crazy, because there's so many people just like checking out of reality with them, and like amping up their own distorted worldview through them. And like harm reduction goes beyond just being like, these are good drugs and these are bad drugs. You can have chaotic use with pretty much any substance. Like I have chaotic use with caffeine. Like I drink it a
Most
lot.
people do. That's one of those legal ones. Woo.
Yeah, yeah. So I think like the weird misconception that psychedelics are like a safer class of drugs is just like weird. It's weird. It doesn't track.
No, I know. It's the nuance of it all, right? We can have
Hmm.
different types of relationships to substances, and for me it was just, ringing the realities for me since I do a lot of research in kink as well, like the realities that like, we've been
Yeah.
fighting for so long to establish that kink is not a pathology, right? Kink is not pathology, and we're obviously not fully there of an acceptance space, but also once we get to the space of acceptance with drugs, kink, all the things, we have to name the reality that there's different types of relationships to these practices. It's not all good.
Yeah.
It's not all bad. It is nuanced. And we have to
Yeah.
get into that with the relationships to these types of things. And so it's important to have conversations about this to be able to like flesh that out when particularly the societal messaging around these things for so long has been so shame laden that we fight so hard to get out to the other side and get there, but then we have to hold the nuance that it is complex across the board for people and the ways that we connect to these things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can actually like speak to the kink thing
I'd love
too,
to.
as
Yeah,
someone
talk to
who's
me.
like used kink and community around that to like reflect my own transition, my own trauma, to like understand those things better. I just have spent years, and also this may be really taboo, but like mixing psychedelics and kink I have done. There's been like some really like deep and powerful healing that can happen around like both of those things. I'm so grateful that I've had like people around me to explore those things with, and like, I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything, because like they've helped me be more at peace with myself, which is helping me like bring a better self to the world. Harm reduction all around. Like kink has its own harm reduction and consent, and I think it's actually really valuable for people who are curious to explore those things, because it really forces you to like think about the way that you engage in sexual activity, and how little maybe like outright consent happens in a lot of like cis straight heteronormative sexual situations. And I would also like extrapolate that to like consent around general consent. When you start exploring psychedelics and kink and pushing deeper into some of these communities, explicit consent becomes so important, and you start looking for that in your like day-to-day life from other people that you interact with, and really does change your perspective of how you move with other people, which is something that I think a lot of folks don't ever think about, honestly. I really think that there's a lot of people out there that don't ever think about consent, coming in and friend dumping like some trauma thing that they're going through without like making sure that there's space for it, or like, physical interaction without consent is like very common amongst cis het people. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but like there's just not a culture of consent a lot of the time. Queerness, psychedelics, kink, these things all force that, because you're dealing in spaces where people might have things that they're going through and require more, more than what society deems as like, this is consent, like lukewarm consent does not exist in kink spaces or should not exist in kink spaces. Like enthusiastic consent all the way 100 to 100%,
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think that there's actually something that folks who live maybe not vanilla, but vanilla cis het heteronormative, less explored lives could really benefit from learning these things. So get out there and learn consent.
Yeah, which is tricky because you.
It's so lacking just generally.
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, yeah, and it's hard to learn that until you're in the community, right? Because like you were saying, by any means, cishet, relationships without like completely demonizing that world, obviously. But the reality is like what you see within, particularly, media. Let's just name media, right? Every
Yeah.
single dynamic I see in sexuality, it's the man that proceeds to come in and lead and actually typically push, and the woman will be like, no, I'm not interested, but then he pursues, and then they go deeper and lead the whole. I mean, we can the consent around that. I mean, I'm not 50 shades of gray. Do I even have to state it?
Yeah.
It's absurd. Watching that, I was just so overtly shocked by the consent violations by that, and to know that thousands of people have watched that and found that exciting and erotic. I mean, it's a reflection of rape culture in our society and the way that that's been internalized. And it's wild to me to think about the ways that like power dynamics are present always, right? In this podcast space, I try to name that at the beginning, like consent with you, of where we go and talk, because there's a power dynamic that I have, right? Or if I'm
Hmm.
talking in therapy with a person of color, right? There's a power dynamic inherently with our society that needs to be
Hmm.
named. When I'm with a professor, they might not even realize, because to them, they're just themselves. But the reality is they're assessing and grading, and they have to be conscious of that power dynamic and how it impacts the
Hmm.
things. And so the reality is like power dynamics are inherent across our lives in so many different ways, and we're not as conscious of how they impact other people. Like you even said, like, talking when maybe your friend doesn't have that space, or checking in with them. It's just, there's so many different ways that we don't check in for consent about the inherent power dynamics that exist in our relationships. And so I think you're hitting on something that's so important, which is the consciousness to the best of our abilities, right? And that's a journey process, and we're all going on that at different rates depending on the privilege of our
Hmm.
community around us, because that's how I got here. I'm sure you could speak to that, right? Like that growing process
Yeah.
of not even knowing that you were making these small consent violations, small, maybe I shouldn't say that, right? Consent violations that you didn't even realize were off-putting and hurting other people, until people gently nudged you and were like, hey, like, this isn't okay.
Yeah.
This
And
is our
I'm
community standards, and growing.
so eternally grateful for those people that
Totally.
took the time to be like,
Yes.
whoa, 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 like hold on. I'm grateful to all of the weird, queer, beautiful partners that I've had over the years who have like taught me about consent, even like learning to hold my own boundaries and not let people violate them, as like not to get too serious, but as like a sexual assault survivor
Yeah.
and a childhood abuse survivor, like it's very difficult to learn consent
Mhm.
when your own like boundaries have been violated.
Yes.
So like helping me work through some of those things in kink spaces, in psychedelic spaces, in sexual situations, and
Yeah.
like having to like learn to like create consent before going into these experiences with people that I trust, and even
Mhm.
just finding the right people for me to trust and like learning to draw boundaries with others is it's so critical and so difficult, and often like in a lot of sexual interactions, especially or romantic interactions, is like overlooked as like excitement in the moment, and like you just want to like go for it, and you're like, wait, like I need to check in with myself, I need to check in with this person that I'm engaging with. I see that a lot in like my own maybe like history with like chaotic alcohol usage and
Mm,
like engaging with people and just like
sure.
being like whatever, because you're like tipsy and you're just like
Yeah.
it's fine, but then like
Hmm.
the ramifications of that like afterwards for yourself, for other people, like learning to, I think for me it was like, wow, maybe I need to like step back from like always engaging in this way, and then like maybe feeling not awesome about like just like being like whatever about my consent things, earlier on in my like sexual experiences versus now where I'm like, let's talk about this shit and like figure out like what our boundaries are ahead of time so that if we're going
Mm,
into this, like we know what's up. Like we know where we can go, where we can't go, what's okay, what's not okay. And like we can have that space to pause. There's also just like I think with substance use and sex, like there's this willingness to just like let it go, or like at least my own willingness to just be like whatever, in the past, and like maybe let situations like occur that I wasn't like super jazzed about in retrospect. And like it's been very beneficial for me in engaging with like the kink space, and also just like generally engaging with psychedelics has given me like an opportunity to like pause in a
mm,
lot of ways
yeah.
and really assess what I was looking for more than like, like, we've been on a few dates, let's just hook up and it'll be fine. Like,
Hmm.
or this is our first date and let's just hook up because it's fun and it's exciting. And it's like, wait, maybe I don't feel great about that afterwards. Or maybe the way in which I'm engaging with people doesn't feel great afterwards. So, like,
Hmm.
I see you're making this like kind of crunched face, and I'm like, hope I'm not making you cringe too much,
No,
but like, but it's like, I really just like that consent culture really needs to permeate in more ways, I think, into our society because people just don't realize the impact they have on others sometimes, and like the impact that you're having on yourself if you're not like being honest in a sober space about where you want to go and where you want to be.
hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, no cringy face to me. I mean, that hits on so many of the reasons why I know you'd asked me earlier too why I started the podcast. There's definitely that lineage with my family and stuff, but also, a survivor as well. I volunteered as a sexual assault counselor. That's what propelled me into the field of psychology. I got to the field of psychology. There was no education on how to support people with this at
mhm,
all. What I got was very minimum of like initial trauma assessment, if that really. So it was
mhm,
really a passion for me to step into the space of like, what does it look like to actually heal to a space of pleasure again, right? And so you're
mhm.
speaking on that of the ways that like kink and psychedelics have been so powerful, which my face is nodding because I'm like, yeah, me too. So it's validating when I hear other people that have had experiences like that. And I think it's such an important story to get out there because we know we're not the only ones, right? But because of the
Yeah,
shame, the judgment, the lack of safety, depending on different intersecting identities around drug use, like it's such a
mhm,
story that I don't think has enough airspace, as particularly
mhm.
around kink and psychedelics, right? These different areas of our life. And so I think it's just so important to hit on. And it was making me think about one of my partners who in the kink community, like after a couple of dates wouldn't even kiss me because we were, they like named the fact that like, oh, your endorphins are flooding right now. You're not even in a quote unquote sober state because those endorphins are flooding. And so we're going to wait. And that tease, I hated it, but it was so hot at the same time, And so like just thinking about the different ways that our brains are under, different chemicals, right? Whether it
Yeah,
be the new relationship energy and the endorphins that go with that, or these substances, and being able to take that time and reflect, I'm so glad and thank you for sharing that, vulnerably in the podcast space with us about
yeah,
how, kink and psychedelics have really allowed you to connect to your body potentially is what I'm hearing, and hearing your
yeah,
yes and your no very clearly.
yeah. I think as like an assault survivor and abuse
Hmm.
survivor, like there's this struggle to like, reclaim some of like your autonomy, at least for me. And I enjoyed kink before my assault,
Mm.
and to come back to that with other people in other ways, and like then also hit walls with it and be like, I can't move this part, like that really bad psychedelic experience that mentioned earlier. It was actually the result of like having mixing my desire to explore kink and psychedelics together, and like going there with a partner that I was with and hitting this block over and
Mm,
over again where I was just like shutting down in the middle of our experiences, and that was like causing tension. So I actually went into that experience with the intention of like, what is stopping this for me? Like, what's blocking me? Let's like explore in this space alone. Like, what is coming up for me that I'm not able to process because I'm with another person and
yeah.
there's a desire to be doing this thing. And some of the things that came up for me were things that I like needed to remember or needed to work through that were like causing me to like not be able to move really forward past this like one space with that partner. But like, while that experience was very difficult and I found it like the singular individual experience that I had was traumatizing, it was necessary for me to like have that come up to move past it. And like there was no moving past it in the space that I was in with that partner at the time. Like they just couldn't support me in that moment, didn't really know what to do for me. And I needed to sit down and be like, okay, what's actually coming up? And like,
Yeah.
what do I need to understand about myself in this space so that I can, again, like find pleasure from these things? And like, to be fair, as I've gone through like years of psychedelic use and, kink play and like whatever, as I've started transitioning, like the things that I like, the things that I want, like the things that I find sexy have changed.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
and like being open to that and not like pigeonholing yourself into like, these are the kinky things that I like, and it's only XYZ, and being open to like trying new things, meeting other different people who are into things that I'm like, I don't know if I'm into that, but then like you're like, oh fuck, I'm into that. Like
Yeah.
like, damn, I guess that's a new thing that I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to like
Yes.
play with for a while or whatever, explore. But like I've also let go of some of the things that I was like super into, which is
Sure.
normal. And I think also people need to give themselves the flexibility to like, if you're enjoying kink and part of it for you is like working through things, like recognizing that maybe those things won't always remain the same. Cause like
Mhm.
your kink can change based on like what parts of you maybe you've already worked on, and like
Sure.
maybe that thing just doesn't get you there anymore because it's like you've taken the piss out of it, by
Sure.
actually like coming to terms with whatever was coming up for you in that space that was making you feel good or whatever. The buttons change also as I think you
Mhm.
get older. So
Sure.
I'm grateful to my kink partners and to psychedelics for like allowing me some space to change and be a different kinky version of myself as I've gotten older and
Mhm.
transitioned. So bless.
Yeah, altered states of consciousness and the beauty and the transformation of community, right? And in both settings, whether it's with the medicine, larger community, the play, all of that. And it's beautiful to know that like we're in this ever evolving process of knowing ourselves, right? That the fantasies, the buttons, the things, those change over time. And that can be scary because then maybe that one thing that you were so certain you would never touch suddenly starts calling to you in a way. And you're like, I gotta walk that back. I gotta walk that back. But like, how beautiful that like we can look ahead to the whatever amount of years that we're lucky to live, in this lifetime and know that I'll still be finding boxes that teach me things about myself that I never thought I would know?
I'm grateful.
Mm-hmm. And I know you named too at the beginning that like, oh, this might be a taboo or whatever word we want to use topic to talk about, kink and drugs and psychedelics, and it is for many good reasons, right?
Yeah.
Within in terms of safety, and and
Yeah.
all of that. But the reality is, like, it's also happening. And I really appreciate it. I talked to somatic sex educator Britta Love, and we had this like deeper
Yeah.
conversation that I think has really stuck with me in terms of, like assessing what are your relationships to these practices, right? What is your relationship to the substance? Is this your first time? Do you use a
Hmm.
substance every day? Do you feel very comfortable walking in that land? Like, who are the people you're playing with? First time
Yeah.
versus years, right? What's the play that you're doing? Is this, or, is this kidnapping? Are we spanking? Like, where are we at in that terms of edge
Yeah.
play, right? That makes, like, we say kink, right? And you and I might know the expansiveness of that, but someone else might
Yeah.
be like completely projecting, breath play or other sorts of things, whatever. And it's like, there's just so much nuance to all of this, and that's why I really appreciated Britta's perspective to it of, like, what's your relationship to the type of play, to the people, to the drugs, and trying to get to a
Yeah.
more like nuanced space of hopefully consent and best practices and harm reduction and all of that, because the reality is it's happening.
Yeah, and there's also a different, like, risk profile with all different kinds of kink that you can engage. Like, kink is such a, like, too general of a term,
I know.
There's some things that's, like, maybe that's not the thing to engage in while you're both in an altered state, or maybe one of you is, like, less inebriated and, like,
Yeah,
has a little bit more grounding, or, like, like, impact play can turn into a lot, and maybe you're not realizing the sensations, or, like, I think, like, especially in my experiences with LSD and sex, like, impact play has, like, you have to have a lot of trust and, like, consent boundaries, like, drawn before you get into that place, because it's easy to drop into a space where you're just like, "I could just, like, deal with it, I could take it all." Like, you process these things that you process pain
differently.
differently, you
Yeah.
process, like, sensation differently, on
Mhm.
psychedelics, and, like, and any substance, let's be honest, like, you process things differently on substances. So to, like, have clear boundaries, I think goes back to, like, necessary always understanding, like, what consent really looks like, and, like, how to literally, you can write down what's okay and what's not okay if you're going into an experience with someone. And, like, I don't suggest to anybody that they go and, like, have freaky sex and do psychedelics with someone they've never met. Like, that's a terrible idea. That's a terrible idea. Exploring with, like, trusted partners at the beginning, and, like, learning to draw healthy boundaries on, like, doses that are, like, keeping you fairly grounded. Maybe you're just microdosing and messing around, and, like, it's easy to not go too far with something like that versus, like, I'm gonna take 500 UG and, like, 500 micrograms and, like, have a really wild night. Like, that's
Yeah.
very different.
It is very different. That's,
So
again, the nuance of all of this, right? The nuance is so deep, which I appreciate you speaking to. And the reality is we need more. I like harm reduction, but harm reduction and pleasure enhancement, right? We need more conversations about how we have both so that we can be safe and that so that we can have pleasure. And so I really appreciate you speaking to your lived experience that we know many people are playing with and exploring to. And so trying to get into the safest containers we can with these different
yeah,
relationships to these different practices and different things, I think is such a important conversation to have with the world.
yeah, totally agree.
Mhm.
Please start low and slow, and don't just
Yeah,
decide to do psychedelics and kink all for the first time at the same time. It's terrible. It's not gonna go well no matter what.
totally, totally, totally. Yeah. I've been liking this question I've been asking a lot of my guests too towards the end, and I'd like to pose it here for you, which is if you could go back to that younger self that maybe had never heard of kink, never touched psychedelics, I'm curious if there's anything that you would want to say to them.
It's better to know. A lot of my youthful fear around psychedelics was very influenced by, like, dare and, like, the you're gonna go crazy. And as a young person that, like, dealt with depression from a young age, I was always like, what if it fucks me up worse? What if it fucks me up worse? Well, like, did for a little while. Like, dealing with some of my trauma that came up did fuck me up worse for a while. But, like, I'm a better person for it now. I would have told younger me, like, don't be scared and don't be ashamed, no matter whether it's like fear of like the unknown or fear of like stirring the pot in the wrong way, like, or fear of just like being seen and like having my body seen, because I've always dealt with a lot of disconnection from my body because of some of the trauma that I've endured in my life. And I truly don't believe that I would be where I'm at today in my life, the like better adjusted, I won't say well adjusted, better adjusted,
Sure.
um, happier, healthier
Yeah.
individual without the experiences that I've had. And like,
Mhm.
for good, for bad, for better or worse, it has shaped me. And I would tell younger me not to be scared and not to be ashamed. Just,
Mhm.
it'll be okay.
Mhm. Yeah, such
Which
powerful
is, I know,
words.
like something that like older queer people say to younger queer people, like it'll be okay. And like in the current like societal climate, maybe it doesn't feel like it'll be okay, but being the real you is better than not.
And people are drawn to that. People feel that, and it's
Yeah.
different. As you were speaking to, it was reminding me of some of the metaphors that we use about psychedelics. So I don't know if this will resonate for you, but sometimes we talk about those experiences where they're coming up, almost as a splinter. If you have a piece in your finger per se, the body naturally wants to push it out, right? And it gets
Hmm.
festered and starts to pus up. And because of the need to survive in our conditions, many of us have to push that down, and we keep pushing it down. Like, I don't want it to come out, because when you start to actually kind of pull it hurts. Like, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
Keep that there, pack that down. But then we go around life like using our finger, and it's tapping this pain point that we haven't processed. But the actual process of pulling that splinter out can hurt, right? And
Yeah.
we have these psychedelic experiences where it brings up really difficult things and it hurts, right? But we're getting that splinter out and being able to
Yeah.
have that process, and our body is trying to do that. And so that inner healing wisdom to bring those things up when they need to be can be so powerful.
Yeah. I'm grateful for some of the difficult experiences I've had. Like, it's hard to be grateful in the moment
Yeah.
when you feel like your world has been shattered, but at the same time, like, I would not have decided to start working on Queerly Psychedelic if it wasn't for those painful moments. I like would not feel called to like help support queer people
Yeah.
in the ways that I try to now if it
Yeah.
wasn't for psychedelics, if it wasn't for those difficult experiences. So like I'm grateful, even though some of it maybe didn't need to happen.
Yes, I hear that. I hear that.
I'm grateful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show and to hear about your experiences and to share that with the community. Towards the end of every podcast, I always check in with the guests to make sure there wasn't anything they wanted to say to the listeners directly. Otherwise, I can guide us towards a closing question, and then I'll provide space for you to plug away at the end as well for everything that you do.
Yeah, I think I'm good. I really appreciate you inviting me on and the opportunity to just, kind of talk about my experience with queerness and psychedelics and also kink. I wasn't necessarily expecting to throw that in there, but like it is important to me too.
Altered states of
So,
consciousness. Yeah.
yeah. So thank you.
Of course, it's been a blast. Well, then, the one question I ask every guest on the show is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Not knowing who you are until you're older. As someone who didn't start transitioning until their mid 30s and is in their 40s now and is really just getting full swing, like especially to young trans people, like your life does not end at 22 if you haven't started transitioning or you haven't fully figured it out. And like, you don't always have to figure it out when you're young. It can take time, and that's okay. And there's
Mhm.
something really beautiful about that. I'm grateful to be where I'm at now, and I'm okay that it took me this long to get here. Like,
Mm,
it happened in the time that it was gonna happen in.
yeah,
So,
holding space for that process and all of that
yeah.
journey that it is, and I assume the continued journey that it will be with every day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I'm not there yet. So
And the expansiveness of that, right? And the play that is possible. I don't know if you know Ray McDaniel.
not off the top of my head.
They wrote the book Gender Magic, and it was beautiful to have them on the podcast. They were talking about a lot of the work that they do with clients on gender and helping people to see it in this expansive play way instead of the I'm trying to figure out what box fits to the vast sky and all of the ways that we can exist in the world. And so that continued evolution of what it means, I'm sure is also part of the joy and the experience of yourself.
Yeah. I think had I been ready to transition younger, I would have looked at it in a lot more simple and binary terms, whereas now I really do embrace being a non-binary queer trans person. Like, I think if younger me had been like, I'm transitioning, it would have been like a very like more cut and dry thing. And I'm really like trying to embrace the weird journey than
Mm,
it's been versus
yeah,
like trying to have a destination specifically. So
beautiful.
I think there's something awesome about not having a destination.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing to create the spaces that you're creating for queer people and psychedelics and to
Thank
be a
you.
resource for them. We definitely need you in this world.
Thank you.
Of
I'm
course.
grateful to be here still.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Where would you want to plug for people that are connecting with you and want to hear more about all the work that you're doing?
best place to find me is probably unfortunately Instagram. Like, I'm one person show with Queerly Psychedelics. So I like, if you want to follow what I'm doing, you can find me there. I occasionally speak and sometimes do podcasts. Now
Yeah.
apparently I can check that little box.
Hell yeah.
People can message me on there. Like, I'm chill. I try and be responsive. I also limit my time because social media is like not always great for my mental health, but I would hope in the next year to be doing some more in-person events. I'm doing a test, taking some queer folks out to the desert to view the eclipse,
Very
and
fun.
be in queer communities. So would hope that I can take that and make another one for other queer people. So
Yeah.
I guess just follow me on Instagram, and if there's something you want to do or collaborate, hit me up. I'm down. I'm in the Denver-ish area, but I'm down to do things all over the place. So
Great.
yeah,
Great.
queerly underscore psychedelic. I guess I should probably put that out there. I guess if you like search queerly psychedelic, I'm the only thing that comes up. So
Yeah. And I'll have it linked in the
um,
show notes below too, so people can go directly to it.
thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. Keep shining your bright light.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.